Great. So we anticipate that that Rich will be joining us in a moment, but we'll go ahead and get started since we do have a quorum. We have a number of tasks in front of us today that lead into our sort of broader set of tasks for our subcommittee and the individual task leads in terms of drafting and other things as we get the plan together. We are in the heading into the fourth quarter of the game for sure. If not crunch time, we've got some deadlines coming up that Jane will walk through that we're in good shape for, and some good prioritization work that's happened and that we are going to discuss today. And then some other pieces such as the sectoral proportionality that a small group of us have been working on, and some other things that we'll present to you today. So hope everybody's had a chance to review the agenda. We are looking forward to the discussion. So we currently do not have a break on the calendar, but I'm thinking that we will try to do that. If we can work through the prioritization in an effective way, that should give us plenty of time for a break after public comment before we get into the next piece. That makes sense, folks? Understanding that this is right over the lunch hour and you're working through it, so appreciate it. So with that said, any concern about either the agenda or the minutes the draft minutes as they've been published that we need to address before we move forward and approve them? Okay, we will consider those approved. And so the goal now is to walk through the prioritization work. I think everybody is on the same page and same level of work now for us to talk about the prioritization and which items we want to elevate, because that will have knock-on effects in terms of what drafting needs to occur and what work for implementing the equity framework and how that will work. So that's an important kind of piece for us to have nailed down. I know folks have had some time to relook and think about that based on the new guidance that Jane put out. Oh, thanks, Jane. Yeah, I realized we didn't get there. So we will get to the minutes. They're pretty basic because we worked through the pieces of the equity screen last week, but we didn't really we didn't have a lot of substantive discussion. So we'll get those notes out to folks. Right. Hello, Rich.
Hey there.
Just getting started, given our significant tasks in front of us. So I think we were gonna make sure that we had time to do transportation well and give you guys first billings so that we can go through the prioritization work that you've done and to determine whether there's concurrence with the way the framework is shaken out and whether or not there are items that have not scored as highly in the prioritization framework that we want to elevate as sort of self-selection as a subcommittee. Jane, is there anything about process-wise in terms of how that would work that you want us to remind folks of in terms of what prioritization means?
I think we've tried to be as clear as possible, and I know in our conversations this week in individual task meetings, I hope everything's come through clearly in my understanding from folks that they're prepared to present their spreadsheets today or a communicable version of their spreadsheets in some way right now, so that we can all see and reach consensus on those high priority actions and then lift up any medium or low for other reasons as a group today. And hopefully all the meetings we've been having with EFG and CADMIS have helped to provide the details that you needed around the impact component of the prioritization. So I think we're in a good spot and look forward to going through it and then transitioning to think about what next steps look like for drafting and beyond. Thanks.
Great. So I guess I would look to Joey and Gina to share your work and walk us through and make your prioritization recommendations, either for the things that naturally rose in the ranking or ones that you would like to see us discuss and consider elevating?
Sounds good. I very much look forward to the discussion. I think Gina and I both do. I'm going to take it from here. So anyway, I think we're all wrestling with undertaking pretty significant analyses at this moment, which is really important, but based on the LEAP modeling, years of work to date, and drawing on our and many others' professional input and the public input, Gina and I have worked with a few folks on the DEC team to apply the prioritization criteria and lay out for your consideration and an important conversation today, sort of our recommendations and frame about how we reduce emissions in the transportation sector. Again, as we all know, this is 40% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So while there are many more things that we would have liked to put on the table and must be on the table for future work and consideration in the next year and coming years, we've really aimed to focus in on a broad bucket of strategies that we hope you will support or help us further refine, and then put forward for the full council consideration and ultimately in the initial climate action plan. But before I dig in, just a few things. So while we very much appreciate the need to transparently screen these recommendations through the prioritization framework, which we did, and I'm looking forward to share with you in a moment. You know, it's a really important instrument, but also fairly blunt instrument, I think, that fails to capture some of the nuance of a lot of the complicated policy program practical solutions that we're going to need to change this very carbon intensive sector and our trajectory in the transportation world and beyond. So, you know, just as an example, as we applied the prioritization screen in terms of co-benefits, you know, the analysis asks us to analyze an action based on its ability to be easily communicated with broad and varied benefits to Vermonters and Vermont itself. So we did that. And, you know, sort of beyond how we communicated, we have really been looking at and considering how we consider and quantify the co-benefits, such as, really importantly, as many people know, improved health outcomes. So you won't see some of those considerations noted here. I mean, the task was to sort of note high, medium, and low, but those considerations are in our mind, and we want to raise them, especially as it relates to some of the recommendations that may score lower on greenhouse gas emissions and cost effectiveness, but that we believe are highly valuable as they relate to co-benefits, equity considerations, and equity outcomes, and ultimately to longer term greenhouse gas emission reductions. So you're going to see what I'm talking to a bit later. But also just to note, I mean, I think this is true for all of us. We have yet to formally apply the equity rubric to each of these, but that's our work in the coming days. That said, the consideration of equity and access and opportunity and the consideration in this necessary transition of all Vermonters has been top of mind for us since this process began. So we look forward to formally applying the rubric and continuing to refine these recommendations and this work, both for the initial climate action plan, but also far beyond, knowing that what we deliver and act upon on December 1st and in the next year is part of a long-term iterative and essential process, not just for the Climate Council, but in the venues where further consideration and refinement will take place on program and policy design. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment, but I mean, I think we have been barking up this tree and sort of sharing with you where we really think we need to focus, which is, in short, on light duty electrification of the vehicle fleet, electrification of the heavy duty vehicle fleet, the reduction of vehicle miles traveled, lowering the carbon intensity of fuels, and really enabling our ability to do all of this important work through the fifth bucket of effective administration and coordination of climate programs and policy. So that's just where I wanted to start. And then I'm gonna share my screen if I can.
While you're doing that, I would just say thank you for the work. I know it's a lot in the transportation space. There's a lot there, and I appreciate the work that's done into it and the support that the DC staff have been able to offer. I do want to add for folks generally that obviously we have an imperfect set of information and data to support prioritization. And the best we can do is identify where those gaps are and the assumptions that we've made to try to work our way through it and be transparent about that process. Where we don't have perfect information at this point, we will never have perfect information. I think just accepting that and recognizing we still need to move is important.
Thank you, Peter. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for saying that. And yes, thank you for putting a finer point on the significant thanks I want to lend and offer from Gina and myself to the DEC team, bringing their knowledge and years of professional experience and expertise to the table in this process. So hang on, share my screen. Okay. Can folks see my screen? Excel documents are incredibly unwieldy in general, and it's like really teeny weeny font. Can folks see it?
Yes.
Okay. And I would make it bigger, but you'll see here these are the pathways, strategies, and actions. And we've bucketed our pathways in the 5 big buckets that I've shared with you here. Electrification of the light duty fleet. Put your glasses on, people. I'm so sorry, it's really small. And I'm gonna walk through these. You've seen these before. And maybe I'm going to try to walk through them fairly quickly because I really do want to get to the conversation. But the long and the short of it is electrification of the light duty fleet informed by the LEAP modeling is a high priority. And we have bucketed that work. It includes several different components of the electrification strategy, which includes these operational tasks, includes EV purchase incentives. So really, and this for us, you'll see here in this big bucket here, it's incentives for new plug-in electric vehicles, but also for us includes core components related to the accessible transition in support of lower income overburdened Vermonters through programs like Mileage Smart, Replace Your Ride, electric bike incentive programs, and potentially other programs that we may need to really ensure and open the opportunity for vehicle electrification and transportation electrification to all Vermonters. So we analyze this in terms of its impact. It scores high both on carbon pollution, reductions, cost effectiveness. This is really hard. Co-benefits and technical feasibility. These are all high rankings. And again, we have not fully applied the equity rubric. We will go through that process in the coming days. But from our work to date and what we are recommending, we think we can craft the programs to serve, to better serve and ensure we are driving equity outcomes. So that is one big bucket, electric vehicle purchase incentives. We have also recommending designing and implementing a vehicle efficiency price adjustment, which is linked to new vehicle purchase and use tax. Again, new vehicles within vehicle classes to incentivize purchase of more efficient vehicles, electric vehicles in particular, and disincent the purchase of less efficient vehicles. I would say this also from our analysis scores high. It's really hard to see. And again, while we have not formally applied the equity rubric, we have been conferring with folks and really think about wanting to explore this program. An approach like this to consider, income and potentially business use. So this is again in the bucket of scoring high. Sort of state lead by example and requiring state vehicle, light duty vehicle purchases is in that bucket as well, scoring high across the board. And public investment and investment in electric vehicle supply equipment, charging. So building out our level 2 and level 3 vehicle charging networks to essentially create the electrification infrastructure that we and people are going to need to, charge their electric vehicles and benefit from the, clean electrification of our transportation system. So again, this whole bucket scores high across the board, and the equity analysis, for us, as you'll see here, we have again, have not formally applied the rubric to like the charging fleet, but really have been thinking about and informing ourselves about how to make this more equitable by prioritizing multifamily, public charging, et cetera. So building out a network that serves everyone. In this bucket as well, this is so unwieldy, sorry, includes participating in the carbon market for transportation fuels, and our longstanding recommendation to join the Transportation Climate Initiative program, adopting the program through rule. And for us, this is a two-pronged, two-part strategy, enacting a complementary policy that goes further to ensure equity outcomes. So that is really an enabling feature to support and fund the programs that we're talking about in the electric vehicle light duty space. So I'm going to move on. And again, I'm doing this fairly quickly, but I guess for the long and short of it is a bunch of this stuff has been on the table for a while, and I will share this still work in progress Excel sheet with Jane, so you can share and people can give their eyes a little bit of a break and dig into more depth later. But another important component that we have recognized as critical to transforming the transportation sector is the electrification of the heavy duty fleet. And that really includes very critically through the LEAP modeling analysis is really demonstrated that we need the sort of technology forcing programs, those programs that drive the market and bring electric vehicles into the state of Vermont to drive the transformation that we're going to need when it comes to a more clean transportation system. So this really relates to adopting the California Air Resources Board Advanced Clean Trucks rule. And did I skip over that? Oh, I'm sorry. In the light duty space, I critically skipped over the adopting the Air Resources Board Clean Cars 2 regulations again. And I can't believe I did that because that is fundamental to the electrification of the light duty fleet. So apologies for that, incredibly unwieldy here, but I just want to sort of underscore that these programs, the low emissions vehicle, the zero emissions vehicle program, Clean Cars 2, and the Advanced Clean Trucks rule are really important to setting the stage for bringing these cars to market and to Vermont fundamentally. So this bucket of components really scored high for us cumulatively. That being said, when it comes to the analysis of sort of cost effectiveness, we rated that medium because, I mean, as Peter noted, this is a massive transformation that is happening, globally, nationally, and in Vermont. I mean, we do not yet have at our fingertips those heavy duty vehicles yet, but this market is evolving. Big manufacturers are innovating, and we just did not have the numbers to be able. I mean, we think we can get there. We have like in the solar sector, we have demonstrated that, the market is shifting. You can make clean energy technologies available and cost competitive and really actually cost really beneficial and with primacy over fossil fuels when the market is transformed. So, but just to draw a note too, we sort of ranked cost effectiveness medium here. So, but again, in general, this bucket of work very much ranked high for us. And I will draw your attention to, this also includes, joining the TCI program and adopting rules to participate, again, sort of creating that enabling environment and funding the innovation, beginning to fund the innovation that we need. Third big bucket for us is the reduction of vehicle miles traveled. Sort of this bucket of smart growth and land use strategies that set the stage for transportation demand management and transportation options beyond the single occupancy vehicle or beyond vehicles, to really give Vermonters different ways to get where they need to go. And this is a massive, important bucket of work and of focus. If you apply the LEAP modeling to the VMT reduction strategies, they do not score high on a greenhouse gas emissions or cost effectiveness screen up to 2030 in particular. But we have a bucket of work here that we really have, we have identified as low based upon the LEAP modeling, low when it comes to cost effectiveness. But when it comes to column M here, which is co-benefits, and to the technical feasibility and to the equity screen, again, that we have yet to apply, but we have heard is, very fundamental, not only to, again, co-benefits like public health outcomes, but also to equity considerations, again, giving people options for where they need to go that are affordable and accessible. And importantly, we wanted to rank it high and ask for your consideration, exploration with us, because we think this bucket of work is really fundamental to achieving greenhouse emission outcomes in the out years. So for us, oh God, I'm so sorry. The reduction of vehicle miles traveled is really an important component of the work. So again, this is what we really want to explore with you. So it includes things like, planning, land use, extending fare-free transit, funding, expanding complete streets, our commitment to sort of Amtrak intercity bus, microtransit, which is we're learning more about the equity component and the niche that microtransit might fill in our current transportation system. And it includes things potentially to better expand broadband. So it's a big old suite of strategies that may score low in greenhouse gas emissions and cost effectiveness, but we want to put on the table for the flexibility that this prioritization framework enables to sort of bundle up the analysis and give it a higher priority. And we believe the Transportation and Climate Initiative revenues could also fund some of those programs. Going to move into the fourth bucket, which is lowering the carbon intensity of fuels and fuel switching. And for us, this is really, the fundamental component here, which is a high greenhouse gas emissions, scores high via the greenhouse gas emissions and cost effectiveness screen, is joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, adopting the rules to participate in the program, and which is designed to achieve approximately 25% greenhouse gas emissions reductions from 2023 to 2032. And really critically, again, raising the annual revenues from potentially about $19 million in the initial year, 2023, outwards to about $27 million in 2032 to drive the kinds of programs that we have identified and or may further identify as we work to ensure that this transformation and options are available for everyone. We really need the revenues to drive the transformation, and TCI is critical to that. We had identified, in our initial screen, sort of lower, determining the feasibility emissions impact of a low carbon fuel standard. We think that needs further exploration, so we didn't prioritize it, and we wouldn't recommend elevating it to high priority at this moment, but think this suite of strategies in general needs to be on the table, and others as well. So we're doing our best to focus and to prioritize based on the framework, and to really set Vermont on a path to actually making the transformation that we need. So the last big bucket of work and recommendation that we have is the effective administration and coordination of climate change programs and policy. And this is sort of, broadly stated, we need to increase state government and community partner capacity to really, lift the transformation that we're going to need. So we're going to need to invest in the kinds of coordination and the people to undertake that coordination, and to support Vermonters in participating in this process by investing in people power. And that's both, again, in state government. It's also in really critical community partner organizations like our community action agencies, who are running programs like Mileage Smart, who have financial navigator services, and really helping. It's by investing in our regional planning commissions, who play a very fundamental and increasingly important role in implementing their enhanced energy plans, which are connected to the comprehensive energy plan, which is obviously embedded and connected to our work. So while that does not score high, as you will see here, on greenhouse gas emission reductions, we believe it scores high in terms of its cost effectiveness. And we can talk more about that. And low when it comes to sort of co-benefits, but it's really, anyway, long story short, while this is really a key enabling feature to do the work that we are going to need to do to transform the transportation system in a rural state. So again, 40% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions come from the sector that we are putting forward before you today to consider. This is a snapshot of, and a high level overview of, the fundamental things that we think are going to be pivotal to move in the ball down the road successfully. The work is not done, the analyses are not complete, but I think directionally we know that we need to electrify a lot. We got to do that soon. We have the tools at our fingertips to do that. We got to do a lot more in the vehicle miles traveled in the transportation demand management space. And we're going to need the enabling infrastructure to do that. And that means partnering regionally in programs like the Transportation Climate Initiative, which will drive down emissions through the cap itself and fundamentally raise the revenues that we're going to need annually to invest in these programs. And we're going to need to invest in the people power to actually make this big piece of work happen. So now that your eyes may be strained and we threw a ton at you in a very short amount of time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and turn it over to our fabulous chairs.
Can I say one thing? I think the analytical work really helped us make the case for electrification, as we knew is the area we need to focus on, particularly in the light duty sector. And as Joey explained, and we learned from David Hill this week, is that the VMT strategies just they don't have the information they need to really look at Vermont's land use patterns, and that David and others were recommending a future work on figuring that out. VTrans, who also needs to be at the table because a lot of these strategies revolve around investment in transit and other modes, right now is indicating that the cost effectiveness of that is not great because it's so expensive. So that too needs further work in order to better understand and to bring VMT reduction strategies up to where the public really wants them to be. And we heard last week from Cara or I guess it was this week, transit is at the top of the pile. So that's the only thing I wanted to add to what Joey was saying, that we feel strongly on the analytical side for electrification light duty. The other areas are going to require some more investigation. And also we need to layer over, and we haven't really layered over public input other than qualitatively. We haven't gone through that exercise along with equity. And I don't know how those two relate to each other. They're similar. So that's the only thing that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Gina. Why don't we start with Rich and then Chris, and then Jared.
Yeah, let me begin by thanking you. You've done terrific work, and Joey, I greatly appreciate your introduction, which I thought kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of where the work stands, what has been accomplished, what needs to be done going forward. It really helps to frame the whole package that you're putting in front of us. I have a few questions, which I'll just dump out all at once. I think your prioritization, is realistic, and I appreciate the way you've done it. Light duty electrification, leading the pack makes a lot of sense to me. I only have one question, and your list of enabling strategies, the fact that these things by themselves maybe, don't deliver an enormous amount of tons reduced, but in combination, they're needed, they're essential to actually get the job done, is a really important message. And you've packaged, by talking about them as packages, you elevate that message, which I think is really important. I only had one small question in the light duty area. You recommend a set of incentives for light duty electric purchases, including replace your ride, et cetera, a bunch of things there. And then you also recommend a time of sale purchase price adjuster, which we used to call a fee bait. I realize that we have different terms now. And I guess my question is, are those two things basically, could somebody say those two things are redundant? You either give the incentives or you do the fee bait, but you really don't need to do both? Or do we say, well, they'll work in tandem, and whatever we can get out of either one of them, they'll work together?
This is sort of a challenge we have with this approach, in that we have these baskets of policies. The modeling doesn't allow you to differentiate between which of those is going to work the best, even tell you how much charging you need versus how many incentives you need. So we just basketed this stuff together that will then, as we work out the details in the future, we're not going to have those details worked out in the next 2 weeks. That stuff is going to sort itself out. But we want to make sure that it's in these are some critical things that need to be in there now, that we need to be keeping our eyes on. In terms of priority, we know electrification is high. We know we've got to have some kind of incentive, disincentive program. We know we need to do charging. We know we need to do charging for low and moderate income families, et cetera. All that junk is in. That's why this thing is so unwieldy. There's all this stuff that needs to be in there to be clear about what we're talking about, but we don't have all the details.
Okay, that's,
On the very good point that you're making. I've raised that point again and
Okay.
again.
it's a fine answer, and we understand that we are at this point preparing a plan. We aren't writing the rules.
Right.
You know, that, and so we need to, at the plan level, it's fine for it to be in there as an action that could address this area. Okay, next topic has to do with the electrification of heavy duty. And I was surprised to see high cost effectiveness on that. Not knowing myself that the technology to bring these vehicles to market in a rural state is there yet. So maybe
So,
you can help with that.
yes, we can help with that. We're really leaning into the LEAP model and their analysis of that. Their analysis demonstrated high cost effectiveness, high greenhouse gas emission benefits. I think as I articulated, well, I actually did articulate in the cost effectiveness screen, we ranked it as medium, even though it showed a little bit of a different, pushback on the LEAP model analysis a little bit, because we share your assessment of where we are in this moment. And at the same time, participating in the Advanced Clean Trucks 2 and looking directionally at where the market is going in terms of the manufacturing sector and how they're making commitments and how they're innovating. And, I think, our assessment is, similarly, anyway, long story short, we leaned on the LEAP model. We did rank it as medium and not high, as opposed to what the LEAP model said, because of that sort of lack of clarity. I guess I just would just step back to be like, again, let's remind ourselves, this entire endeavors is really founded upon the fact that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in the electric sector because we have required it, and that those requirements have transformed and really catalyzed innovation. We have not done the same thing in our most carbon intensive sectors that do not face that same level of regulatory or requirements. And so we got a lot of work to do, both in Vermont and beyond. So I just want to step back to say that, like, our goal here is to really make significant strides. And as Vermont does that, our partner states are doing that. The nation will do it. People are meeting in COP now to figure out how we're going to act on climate. Like, this work is not going to be done like December 1st next year, beyond. Like, this is directional. So I think our analysis is really on significant electrification, primarily of the light duty fleet. The heavy duty fleet will follow. We need to participate in the programs like Clean Cars 2 and the Advanced Clean Trucks. And then, anyway, so I appreciate the comment. We were very well aware of that. And hopefully it shows up in our medium analysis.
Thanks. And I want to echo your, turning to the next bucket on vehicle miles traveled, echoed your observation that there are numerous co-benefits and including health benefits and land use benefits associated with what you're articulating there, but also recognizing that when we model it, the reduction in tons is not very high, and at least and particularly not in the near term. So I'm looking at, for example, Chris Campany's comment just now in the chat, recognizing that this is what you're suggesting is consistent with long-held Vermont planning goals. And yet I think it's important for us as a climate council to recognize that it's not a big driver of carbon reduction. These policies can be in alignment, but the number of tons that's actually going to get reduced through some of these means is not very high. And I think it's good for us to be really straightforward about that, is to say Vermont has both planning goals and equity goals that are served by these policies. But don't expect that we're going to get a lot of tons of reduction anytime soon out of that. So I'm trying to, what's the right word here, echo back to you a message that I think the Climate Council could adopt in that space. And then my last question, sorry, I just wanted to do them all at once. Lowering the carbon content of fuels. I find that title a little confusing because TCI, which seems to be what you're talking about there, doesn't, as far as I can tell, inherently lower the carbon content of fuels any more than it just reduces the quantity of fossil fuels that will be in the market, and therefore it lowers the carbon content of vehicle miles traveled.
So let me answer that quickly, and I appreciate your comment, and I see others have questions too. It's an imperfect, like we put TCI actually in several, you'll see it show up in at least 4 different spaces here because it's an enabling, but TCI actually puts the obligation on wholesalers to figure out how they're going to reduce carbon emissions. So that could very well be them embracing strategies that lower the carbon content of fuels. Is it imperfect like bucket? Absolutely. So I guess I would just ask us, we can take it out of that. We put it elsewhere because it does not fit tidily in one space, but it could very well help to lower the carbon content of fuels the way the program is designed. And it could do other things too, through the incentives, or excuse me, through the revenues that we could drive into programs.
Right.
So,
I mean, obviously the revenues can support electrification and vehicle change outs and what have you. It just seems like a funny title. That's all.
yeah, it is a funny title, but we were trying to bucket things in like buckets, but I appreciate that. And I get it.
Rich, regarding your first point about cars, road sprawl, and all the health emissions, investment costs to all that, we have our 2 pages in the beginning of our presentation in the report that we are going to raise this, but I think the larger work will be done at the cross group effort that Jane and Joey are involved with, and we hope when they talk about not just smart growth, but how smart growth is enabling VMT reduction through the feasibility of alternative modes, that gets expressed. It needs to get expressed loudly and clearly. And we're not going to have enough room in our 2 pages because we got so many other things we got to talk about. So someone's got to deal with it, and also bringing it back to transportation, not just resilience, but it's got a direct relationship, because if we're just talking about replacing all the cars that are out there now and will continue to grow in the future with electric cars and electric trucks, we're toast. We can't be on that trajectory if we love our state, we love our environment, we love the woods, we're concerned about water quality. We can't do that. It's not feasible. So somewhere in this report that needs to be expressed, and I don't think we're going to be able to do that in our 2 pages.
Thanks, Gina. And I apologize for taking a bunch of time, and I want to yield the floor to Chris and then Jared, I think.
Thanks. So I plugged in this, as Richard noted, I plugged into chat the existing statutes, as well as language from the Vermont Long Range Transportation Plan that requires the agency to support compact settlement, because that's what state law says has to happen. So at some level, we'll see how this gets incorporated into the climate action plan. Of course, statute requires smart growth principles to be applied. But the issue is really, if you're talking about at all any kind of either or situation of like, well, do we electrify the fleet or do we promote smart growth? It's kind of like, again, comparing apples to armadillos. It's both. they're different things. One's immediate term, and the other is looking at our longer term development pattern and what the other larger issues is. Because right now, frankly, under Vermont's land use regulation, there are holes in it big enough to drive plenty of McMansions through onto large lots on Class 3 town roads. You've already got the existing parcels. The biggest problem we have is that we do not invest in the infrastructure to actually make compact settlement possible. So by comparison, in other states where I've lived, especially in the South, they do a fantastic job of building infrastructure, but not such a great job of land use planning. It's the exact inverse, frankly, in New England. We plan the hell out of things, but we don't actually build the infrastructure to support what we say we want. And that's because we rely, I think, too much on the drips of federal funding, and then frankly, all the permitting barriers. It takes, a long time to, apply for the grant for the feasibility, for the feasibility study, then apply for the grant for the engineering study, and then apply for the grant for the building study. Well, it's not even a grant, it's financing. And then we're expecting tiny communities to do this on their own and to be able to finance this on their own. And it's an approach that just doesn't work. And the reason I know it doesn't work is I had led a panel at the Northern New England chapter of the American Planning Association that was titled "The Fallacy of Compact Settlement in the Absence of Infrastructure." And there were about 40 planners in the room from at least Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and probably some interlopers from Massachusetts and elsewhere. And what myself and some other Vermonters did was set the stage, kind of saying, our policies say we need compact settlement for all these reasons, including climate change, energy, resilience, water quality, reducing forest fragmentation, maintaining habitat connectivity. All of our policies, all of our laws say this stuff. So we said, then we raised the challenges that we have here in Vermont with actually making this happen. When I asked the room of those other planners from throughout New England to share their success stories and ideas about how to move building of compact settlement forward through infrastructure investment, nobody raised their hand. And so New England and Vermont has to figure this out. We talk a good line, but we need to figure out what the solution is. I think the issue in part may be we have no aggregator of funds between municipal governments and state government. We have nothing where we aggregate funds to actually be able to implement at an intermunicipal scale or broader scale. I know, I'm not saying county government, I don't know what the model would be in Vermont, but we don't have that aggregator of public funds where locales or regions or whatever can actually do the implementation of the infrastructure to make the compact settlement happen. Somehow this needs to get into the climate action plan. Just flagging that, because my concern is that we're going to continue to, it'll be great if we change the fleet. That's absolutely critical. It's got to happen. But the problem is our development pattern is going to continue to be what it has been since Act 250 was first created, spurred by development down here in the southeastern part of the state, where development was unchecked in rural areas. And we're just going to continue to see the same patterns that we've seen. So that's my framing of the issue. I don't think, Johanna and Gina, the burden is on you. The burden is way bigger even than this panel. It's fundamental to how the state actually deals with achieving what all of its policy goals says it's going to achieve. So.
Well, if you remember, our one action under smart growth is to direct federal funds to downtown and village infrastructure. We've heard this loud and clear over and over again. So our one contribution to that larger discussion over smart growth is fund infrastructure.
And that is certainly our one word on the page, but that was also, then we stopped to be like, and we need to coordinate with ag and ecosystems and rural resilience on a much broader suite of land use and smart growth strategies. So while that's the singular word on the page, to get to your point, we recognize the need for investment in infrastructure. I just don't want this conversation to be like, that's all we need to do. We know we need to do more, and that's why we're working on the sort of cross-sectoral land use strategies with the other subcommittees. Cross-cutting pathway now. Thank you, Jane. You were always at the ready. Jared.
Thanks, Joey. Just want to add my thanks for all the great work and really kind of thorough, comprehensive presentation and assessment. I just want to make one really brief comment on what Rich was saying with regard to cost effectiveness in the heavy duty electrification. And I think that part of the challenge of doing this modeling from now to 2030 is that I think that cost effectiveness is likely to change over time based on the projections of when certain technologies will kind of come to market and become more readily available. So, you know, my sense is that right now, from what I've seen, heavy duty electrification is low on a cost effectiveness ranking. Over time, it'll rise to medium and eventually it'll be highly cost effective. But it's just hard to kind of land on a point of assessment over a 10-year period of where it lands on cost effectiveness. I also really want to just pause and appreciate, you know, you talked, Joey, about the kind of equity assessments that have been done on some of the transportation recommendations, including TCI and vehicle electrification. My understanding is that it has not happened yet, but I am very, very much looking forward to the equity assessment that will happen with regard to vehicle efficiency price adjustments. And that's because I think that has the opportunity to be one of our most effective and equitable tools. And here's why. Generally speaking, in Vermont, this is roughly an average, about 100,000 vehicles are purchased each year. About 2/3 of those are used and about 1/3 are new. The folks who purchase new vehicles tend to be upper and upper middle income. And of course, the folks who are purchasing used vehicles tend to be lower to middle income. And I think the great benefit of a vehicle efficiency price adjustment is that in focusing on new vehicle purchases, we are requiring the folks with means to be accountable for the cost of the extra pollution that new fossil vehicle creates, and enabling folks who make the socially and environmentally responsible choice of purchasing an electric vehicle to have that price come down even further. And my response, Rich, on your question of like, how do these things interact in terms of incentives with relation to a possible fee and rebate program? You know, I think that there's been good examples to date of how those can be stacked on top of each other. I mean, that's what we're seeing with the state electric vehicle incentive and the Replace Your Ride program, for instance. And I think another key difference between the vehicle efficiency price adjustment program and some of the incentives is that the vehicle efficiency price adjustment program is really aimed at new vehicle sales, whereas a lot of the incentive programs are aimed also at helping folks get into used electric PHEV and more efficient vehicles. One of the reasons I think this is so important is because right now, when somebody buys a new fossil vehicle, there is a huge hidden cost in terms of the social and environmental harm that is created by the pollution over the lifetime of that vehicle. If you use EPA numbers, this is very conservative, but on average, a new fossil fuel vehicle over its 12-year life will pollute 55 tons of just carbon dioxide pollution. That's not even accounting, I believe, for all greenhouse gas emissions, 55 tons. If you apply the conservative social cost of carbon in terms of the global damages that creates in terms of health and ecosystems, that's a $5,500 cost to society that is not showing up in the sticker price. And you know, the proposals I've seen for a vehicle efficiency price adjustment are not that high, but I think we need to move to a model where we are accounting for the cost, the lifetime cost, and the social and environmental cost that is created when we continue to purchase fossil fuel equipment, and use that revenue to recognize the social and environmental benefits and reduce the costs of the alternative. So I just want to really appreciate that that is in there, because I think a vehicle efficiency price adjustment is a program that has the possibility to both be really effective at reducing emissions, doing it in a cost-effective, revenue-neutral way, and to really advance equity by focusing on new vehicle purchases and the upper-income people who purchase those, and not subjecting used vehicle purchases and the lower-income folks who purchase those to that requirement.
Thanks for that, Jared. I do want to make sure that we're staying somewhat clear on the agenda. We have, just about 2 hours to do all of the sectors, and that's taken up about 55. Obviously, your transportation's the biggest, so we want to make sure that we devoted that time. Just so that I think we're all clear, Joey and Gina, your recommendation is to include in the body of the cap and do the further equity analysis on those items that scored overall high in your review. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are you recommending any of the other items that were in there be included in the body of the cap?
Well, this is, a question I have is like, again, it's 40% of our 40% comes from transportation. There are a lot more things that have been on the table that are really good ideas that we'd like to put on the table. But in terms of like general direction of what we should be doing and where we should be focusing in this initial iteration, we have done our best to cull and really put a finer point on this is what we're talking about and this is what we think is needed to. So one of the questions I have is, I don't want to, based on public input, based on the many conversations with regional planners and transportation and transit experts, and I don't want to lose some of their good ideas, but I think many of them could be embedded in the programs that we're putting forward. But if there's a way in the cap to encapsulate some of those things that may not be lifted up as high priority, but recognized as important. It sounds like we're going to be doing that for other sectors. So to answer your question, yes, those that score highest priority overall, those are the things that we want to prioritize. And there may be a way to recognize that this is not the full suite of strategies that we know are likely going to be required, or where we should do more work to further analyze. But in this initial go around, we've done our best to synthesize.
Great. I appreciate that sentiment, Joey. And
can I just add one more thing though? I want to make sure we understand this. So VMT reduction, I believe, should be in the cap, but you're saying if it's not high, we don't include it.
I believe you have ranked that as high.
Oh, we have, okay. It's okay, but the analytical piece is not high. It's the other stuff that makes it higher.
Yes, we discussed the ability to weight co-benefits and equity considerations.
Right. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to be clear on that because the numbers don't add up. It's still there. Yep.
Understood. And to be clear with everybody, this is not about what gets in the cap and what gets in it, not because everything will be in the cap. The items that we are going to focus on in the body of the write-up as elevating as the things that we believe need the greatest attention in terms of readiness to act upon. There may be additional things that we feel need additional research and other thoughts around. So I just want to make that clear for everybody. Jared and then Jane.
Sorry, old hand.
Okay, Jane.
I would make a comment that the prioritization tool was just that, a tool to be used at the subcommittee level to elevate actions for the body of the cap. And if you've looked at the cap drafting process, once the actions carry into the body of cap, you're no longer going to see that this one ranked overall high and this ranked overall low, but yet they're all there together. That prioritization will go in an appendix, and you as a subcommittee are by consensus elevating all of those actions together for the council to consider in the body of the climate action plan. So I just want to say that sort of that high low, it's not going to show that way in the body of cap, so people aren't going to be asking like why a low action was carried forward. You'll be making that case in the way you build your action tables, regardless of how the overall prioritization came out.
Okay.
And then I'll just say that anyway. I hopefully that's helpful.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, so I guess the question for us as a subcommittee is, are we comfortable accepting the recommendations of the task leads to forward the high priority items as identified in the spreadsheet as the items that we will focus on in the body of the climate action plan.
I interpret silence as agreement, Peter.
I would as well, in the way we've been working in terms of consensus for sure. So, all right. Thank you for that, Gene and Joey. I know it's taken a long time to get to that point, and I appreciate the work that went into it to do it. Thank you. It's a lot. And I appreciate the way in which you put things into buckets, because they aren't extractable, as we know, and that falls on previous work that we've done. So, all right. Let's move on to building energy use.
Thank you. Let's get this right here. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay, thanks. First, before I start, there was a comment in the chat that I'd like to address. Eric Faneuf says, quote, "We have succeeded in the electric sector," end quote, is a repeated refrain from members of the VCC and foundational to his decisions to focus on transition, the thermal and transportation sectors. But the claimed success is a mirage, and he goes on to point out that the way we're counting renewables is dubious and causes problems. I won't quote the entire question, it's in the chat. I think it's really important to address that. The first point is that accounting for the renewable quality of the energy we use is really important. And I don't disagree with him that it's important to account for it properly. I think in large part, Vermont does that, however. And I would just make a couple observations as to why we think electricity is one of the good avenues to pursue here. The lower 48 states in the United States produce as much carbon today as they did in 1990. But what they do also is produce 30% more energy than they did in 1990. The price of renewable energy has come down significantly. The price of battery storage has come down significantly. And taking advantage of those technologies, the ability to, the digital revolution that's occurred, the ability to manage loads in a way that saves people money, avoids dirtier and more expensive system peaks, is a really important opportunity, and an especially useful one when you consider all the other choices out there. Is it perfect in and of itself? I'm not saying that, but I'm saying when you stack it up to the other choices, electrification is a really useful alternative. And controlled electrification, not electrifying everything, controlled electrification will be critical to us bringing on more renewables and further improving the carbon profile of the electric sector. I just wanted to respond to that comment. What I put up on the screen here is a slide that I put up last week. And I wanted to note that Brian Woods has been really helpful to us. And we have a worksheet in progress that I didn't want to use today. But I basically wanted to just work from this sheet and tell you, excuse me, tell you some of the things we've learned over the last week. And first, I think we stand beside the strategies and actions that we have proposed so far. Weatherization at scale breaks down into a handful of actions that you can see here. Funding is the key constituent of weatherization at scale. Tariff on bill financing is an important way. It will be an important way to get past some of the really fundamental major barriers that we see to developing more efficient use of our buildings. I put in green, coordinating workforce development, financial counseling. not because they're not important, but it's just a little tougher to score those two things because they're constituents of the overall proposal. We think that workforce development and coordinate that across the state. However that gets done, there are different agencies, different organizations that could be capable of coordinating that and supporting all the other agencies and organizations that are doing workforce development. We think that's really important. And the overall prioritization, from what we've learned, these things remain high. Same with rental property efficiency standard. While there may be a medium impact, we think that overall the prioritization is high because we're not talking just about the marginal cost of avoiding tons of carbon. In the power sector, what we're talking about is delivering these reductions in an equitable manner and making sure that overburdened, underserved Vermonters are a central part of the work that's going on here. The second major piece of this is a clean heat standard. And from what we understand from the modeling, we think that this still is a good approach to develop. And I'll talk a little bit more about some particulars here about with respect to that in a second. We rate that high. Adopting appliance standards to an appliance standard that allows the location and control of water heaters, we also think is really important. That's one of those digital, low-cost digital tools that we have out there that could help us take the 25,000 or so water heaters that are changed out each year in Vermont and control them to make sure that we get the greatest reductions in carbon associated with water heating, that we get, that we also take the additional co-benefits associated with managing load and reduce demand on peak. So that also remains high. I'd like to talk a little bit about the prioritization things that we've learned over this week and that we think should be reflected in the CAP. And it has to do first with the importance of recognizing the modeling information that we've been provided. The modeling looks at weatherization at scale. Modeling looks at the clean heat standard and the many sorts of resources that compliance with the clean heat standard would make available, and those resources that would become available to consumers if they want to take steps to invest in lower carbon ways to heat their homes, to heat water. We think that's very important, but the way the modeling works, it looks at each of those sort of it looks at the costs and the carbon reductions associated with, let's say, a heat pump water heater or a weatherized home with a heat pump in it. And it can identify those things, but it's important. One of the things we learned this week is that it's very important to recognize the synergies between these different pieces of with these different solutions. Rich Cowart just used the term package when he was talking about Joey's presentation. And that's a really important thing. The modeling may not show that you get huge benefits from weatherization by itself or certain benefits from a heat pump by itself. But when you put the two together, you get you get the most out of a heat pump and the most out of a weatherized building. And so we learned this week that maybe modeling those synergies is going to be a challenge, but that conveying that to the full climate committee is going to be really important because that's where significant avoided carbon can be secured and can be done in an equitable manner. Some other benefits we think are important to recognize that may not get included in the modeling, but which improve the case for these strategies that we've set out here. Public health benefits probably won't be included, but to the degree that you're avoiding burning fossil fuels, you're avoiding criteria pollutants and inside buildings and out and increasing health benefits. to the degree you're weatherizing buildings, significant health benefits. And I also mentioned coordinating electricity loads, managing that electricity use will produce significant benefits, but the modeling's not going to show that. So we have to convey that, and that just builds a stronger case for overall prioritization that we've set out here. There are costs that may get included ultimately in the modeling that we think are important to include too, because this isn't just, we don't want to just load up the benefit side. We want to look clear-eyed as possible into this and recognize costs. If we're going to coordinate and build up the workforce, for example, that's going to be required to deliver weatherization at scale, just like we had to build up the workforce to deliver all the solar development that we saw over the last decade. You're going to have to pay people more. You're going to have to attract workers, and that's going to include costs. So when you measure the costs of that to the benefits, you'll get a good picture. But we think that recognizing those costs are going to be really important. And one last thing that we learned from our discussion with the modelers today was that even when you stack up these different approaches, something's going to come out least. Something's going to come out least, something's going to middling, something's going to come out high. It's important not to throw away any of those, because thought of all together, presented all together, they will be strong. Some will do better at avoiding tons. Some won't do quite as well, but better than others. And then some won't do as well as the others, but are still important to include. That's where we stand. And so I think our recommendations be subject to learning more about the equity, not learning more, but plugging in what we learned from our finalizing the equity rubric, which we started last week and still underway. And the modeling data that I mentioned, those continue to be our recommendations. And I want to make sure that Christine has a chance to weigh in as well here.
Thanks, Dave. That was super helpful and very well done. There's just one aspect I'd like to call out for purposes of this discussion today that Dave didn't happen to touch on, and that we touched on when we were in the modeling call just the hour before this call. Really detailed modeling is being done by the Cadmus EFG group, and they're counting widgets per year across multiple technical solutions, for example, to meet the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that buildings/thermal need to meet. And they are seeing a pathway to meet those. The clean heat standard is an example of a performance-based standard that will provide the market choice on how to meet what the clean heat standard will set out. So while the modeling is counting widgets and finding a way to achieve the greenhouse gas reduction targets, the market is not necessarily going to fulfill that spreadsheet, and it's the way sales and installation will actually happen. And I just wanted to call that out, because that will be part of the opportunity and the work moving forward to assess what the market is actually achieving as we're implementing the cap, and then affect program offerings and program implementation strategies informed by how the market is moving. And so, for example, their heat pumps may be moving faster than the model initially projected in year 5 of its implementation. But advanced wood heating might be moving slower. And so program design and implementation details might change by those doing that work in order to ensure that the ultimate emissions reductions are being met. So I just wanted to call that out as a dynamic of what the real world will look like if what we're recommending in the cap does get approved and is carried forward. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Christine. Rich, you have a question?
I have a comment, but I'm happy to defer to other people. I don't need to go first if there are others. I don't see other hands, so I'll make the point. Based on the modeling, it looks, if I saw it correctly, the clean heat standard is would deliver the largest fraction of the emission reductions that are on this list. And maybe it doesn't really matter what order we present them in. But if I had been drawing up this list, I would have put it closer to the top of the list and not number 4. That's a small matter. But it's where the tons are.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I think we want to be putting clean heat into weatherized buildings.
And I'm going to
Efficiency first.
I'm gonna argue with you to this extent. We can't wait that long. We can't wait until buildings are weatherized before we put in a pellet stove or blend in biofuel. I think we need to move faster than that. And so I've thought about this a lot, and I've been talking about efficiency first for something like 40 years, but I really think we need to move more quickly.
Well, can we settle at, let's make sure both messages come across loud and clear, please?
Yeah, of course, absolutely, but the pace of weatherization is just not going to be fast enough compared with the number of hot water heaters we need to change out. That, Dave just made the point that there are 25,000 chances every year to upgrade water heaters.
Yeah.
And there's not that many weatherization jobs anytime soon.
Yeah, fair enough.
Same with furnaces.
So thank you all for that. Rich, anything else you want to say? Okay. So I think
I want to just thank the
Yep.
team. This is really terrific. You've presented to us a great slate of recommendations, and that I'm really happy about it.
Thank you. Thanks to Brian Woods too for all his help.
so. I guess I have a question about the rental property efficiency standard piece, and wondering sort of what the analysis is based on, given that one feels a little less developed than others, and just wanted to hear your thoughts there as we think about that, because that will certainly be a complicated one.
You're correct about the level of analysis, although the modeling does reflect the work that would happen with a rental efficiency standard. We could call it weatherization at scale that includes rental properties, or weatherization at scale that focuses on the worst rental properties because overburdened Vermonters occupy those properties. We could call it that. So the modeling has reflected that the sorts of things that would happen when you weatherize buildings are the sort of things that need to happen, especially with rental units. The reason we focused on that, and the reason it's underdeveloped, because it would be a program itself, but the reason we focused on it is that the relative burden that Vermonters experience is stepped up a huge amount when you focus on Vermonters who rent. And we thought that while the simplest order of analysis here would be tons per dollar, how many tons of carbon do you avoid per dollar? The next step of that analysis really has to be, and has to connect, you have to weld together equitable tons, not just the cheapest tons. And we think that's the way to do it in the building sectors, to focus. And I want to emphasize, it's not on all rentals. There are rental units that are probably quite new, up to date, and would exceed any sort of minimum standard that a rental efficiency standard might adopt. the one model, for instance, in Boulder, Colorado, adopts the 1990 IEC model, IEC code. So it's a much older code, but the idea is to bring up the really dreadful, poorly weatherized rental units in the state, and to improve the lives of folks who are unfortunately, due to their economic circumstances or other circumstances, stuck in that housing market.
I think because of the equity appropriate and needed equity focus to the work this time, it would be irresponsible not to tackle this portion of the sector, and especially because we know such a high proportion of rental properties are lived in by those who are of low to moderate income. So we should be, our view is that we should be proposing things even if they are going to be tough, if they need to be done.
So I certainly didn't want to, I wasn't commenting on the effect of the appropriateness of the action. I just, given and I thought your articulation, Dave, of the sort of the overlap between weatherization at scale and that efficiency standard is huge, right? Because we have tried to focus most of our weatherization investment to date to low income properties. The challenge with that has often been those multifamily rental units where there's split incentives and challenges across the board. And so I appreciate the work. I'm just sort of flagging it as something that, again, I think in the way that you write it up for the cap will be important in terms of thinking about the interplay between those things. And I appreciate that. And so that was my only comment.
Helpful, thank you.
And these, I think that goes across the board, would be my sort of thought and guidance for everybody, is that there are going to be lots of things that overlap in terms of their implementation that we simply need to make aware, because we speak in language that we can understand each other most of the time. But as we translate this out into the broader public, we're going to need to make sure that it's clear that there aren't bright lines between many of these issues. And that's part of the reason why the modeling is so challenging, is because they're all related to each other. Right? Are we ready? So I guess, so again, by the looking at of faces, are there any concerns that folks have with forwarding the recommendations that have been elevated by the buildings team? Okay, thank you for some great work, team. And we will move on to the electricity sector.
Great, and I think, is it the case that Ed is not yet with us? Am I right about that? I had to join late because when this was scheduled for the earlier hour, I was booked.
He said that he would be here at 12:30, I think.
Okay, so close.
If you'd like the non-energy group to go first, I'm happy to do that. If that's
Why don't we do that? I think it would be beneficial to have Ed if possible, so.
Yep.
Okay.
Look at us being dynamic on the fly. All right, let me pull up our spreadsheet. And I've tried to hide some columns so that it's a little bit easier to see, but it's not great, in a very similar fashion to what Joey shared with you earlier. I appreciate the simplicity of the buildings team's column for sure. All right, can you all see that? So I want to go back to the sort of the beginning of where we started from a lot of this. As we thought about emissions from the non-energy sector, which includes industrial processes, agriculture, the waste sector, and then emissions from the fossil fuel industry. There were, of those categories, the fossil fuel related emissions are relative to the transmission of and distribution of natural gas. And so those have been incorporated into the building energy team's work. The agriculture and ecosystems subcommittee is working on recommendations relative to agricultural reductions. And then further within the waste sector, there's the solid waste side of things and the wastewater side of things in terms of emissions. And as we have made significant progress in the solid waste sector in terms of those emissions, our recommendations that we brought forward to you today and previously relate to the wastewater sector for the time being. We may need to adjust those in future plans, but for now, that's where those lie. We had several initiatives within the wastewater sector that rank generally as having relatively low impact, but from a greenhouse gas standpoint, but one of which should just be done. And that is the consistent operation, requiring the consistent operation of flares at existing anaerobic digesters so that we're not creating methane and then emitting it into the air. That's kind of a fairly common sense approach. There's obviously some work to do with those communities who have struggled to continuously operate their flare, but we can work on those pieces. So it may not have a huge greenhouse gas impact, but it's very cost effective and it's something that we can do within our existing space. So we've rated that one high overall. There are a number of things that we think that should be done going into the future that we'll continue to do, whether they're in the body of the cap or not, which is really to see if there are opportunities for additional anaerobic digestion at wastewater treatment facilities, and to look at whether there are opportunities to create co-benefits from the generation of electricity from that captured methane, opportunities along those lines. Those are things that we like and we will continue to pursue, but don't think those rise to the sort of level of being primary items that we include at the cap. Same sort of thing along the idea of energy efficiency audits and other things within wastewater treatment facilities. I think we have opportunities to partner with our existing partners to see if there are opportunities for improvement there. But that's a longer term strategy and can use some of the tools that we've got in place already. Same with the idea of increasing the efficiency of our transportation of wastewater uses. So that's the sort of dewatering activities, which take a long time to build out, but we want to get started on some of those projects, or at least exploring with municipalities what's possible. And so then we get into the refrigerant management component of this work, which is really where about 2/3 of our industrial processes emissions come from, is in the ozone depleting substance substitutes, the ODS substitutes. So when we got rid of CFCs and started using HFCs for refrigerants and other things, we created a separate and new problem. And it is in this industrial sector where we have seen most of the growth in new emission sources. We've had changes obviously over time in the emission, different categories of emissions, different sectors, but these are ones where we've seen significant growth because of the use of new chemicals for a number of different uses. So in this one, we've talked a bit about the refrigerant management plan kind of concept of trying to understand how we work with users of HFC and refrigerant operations to help drive down their use, potentially transition, detect leaks, repair those leaks, et cetera. California has gone down an approach of using this sort of refrigerant management plan concept that is going to require a fair amount more work to develop out, but one in which we think will have the potential to have high impact. And so we would like to include that in the body of the cap, because it is, we believe, the most important strategy to address the sector of emissions that is growing the fastest. Then there are other things looking at refrigerant management plan that we can look at including, such as end of life disposal and other things that don't have a significant long-term greenhouse gas impact, but help manage that life cycle of the stream and drive people towards cleaner, less polluting options. And then the final component of the emissions reduction scheme really revolves around global foundries and the emissions associated with their operations. There is, as folks know, there is a PUC proceeding ongoing looking at whether to require emissions reductions overall, including their electricity, thermal, and process emissions through that proceeding. That is ongoing and won't be resolved prior to the issuing of this plan. I believe there is opportunity that if that were a successful path, it could be a way to drive emissions reductions from this sector. But I think as the letter of intent that the Agency of Natural Resources signed, that I signed, included the idea of if it were not to occur, then we would reserve if sufficient emissions reductions were not to occur, we would be looking at potential other regulatory tools to reduce those emissions. So that is one, again, where we feel that one should be included. It won't be as baked as maybe some of the other recommendations, because there's a couple of different paths that it could go down as the plan is in the works. But one in which where we see a significant single source of emissions and opportunities to make those reductions. So those are the 3 items. I'll go over them again. The 3 items are the sort of low-hanging fruit of underutilized flares at anaerobic digesters at wastewater treatment facilities. Kind of a no-brainer. And then the other 2 are refrigerant management plan we'll begin to work to address and transition refrigerants away from HFC use. And then the third one being continued seeking of emissions reductions from the manufacturer of semiconductors. I will add for the latter 2, and this is something that we're going to talk about in a moment later in the agenda, revolves around how we count sectoral emissions proportionality, the contribution piece. A small group of us have been working, starting with Jared's data that he presented a while ago with us, around how we might think about those emissions reductions and how we sort of square where we are currently with the requirements for 1990 and 2005, so that we can make sure those are best, because for both refrigerant management and for the semiconductor manufacturer, they were negligible at best sources of emissions and have risen significantly since 1990. So it makes the sort of calculation for 2030 and 2050 challenging to understand unless we think about proportionality in a way that matches where we are today, which we'll talk about in a bit when Jared presents some of that proposal. So on that note, those are the recommendations. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see your faces, but interested in your thoughts. Rich.
Well, again, I'll wait for other people to speak if they want to. I guess I'm looking for a reminder on one issue and a question. I have a question about another. Just so I understand about flaring of anaerobic emissions from anaerobic digesters. Are you suggesting that the answer is flaring, or that the answer is to take the material that's being flared and find better ways to get useful energy out of it? It's the latter.
It's yes, and at this point, we have several facilities that we create methane from and do not flare. Right, and so do not flare at a baseline. So yes, we would rather see them use that methane to productive ends, but those are longer term investments that would need to be made to make that possible. Getting them to have functional flares would be a great first step.
Okay. So someone else wanted to speak to that? And my question is about Global Foundries and that item. It's a little unclear to me whether the provision that you're seeking would be one that would require reductions in HFCs at, in the industrial process, or whether it's an approach to put a bubble over the entire campus there and treat all emissions associated with the production of chips as a quantity, and therefore including everything, basically, which might include wastewater emissions. It might include emissions associated with electricity consumed on site, as well as CFCs or HFCs. And my question is, if it's the latter, is there an expectation that maybe the reductions won't come from reducing the high global warming forcing chemicals? The reductions would come from doing something else on the facility or within the commute shed of the workers, or who knows what.
So far, the consideration has been for the inclusion, and Colin, if you have other thoughts you'd like to add, please hop in, but the inclusion of emissions from their electricity purchases, their thermal fuels use, and their process emissions. So that roughly equates to the electricity is about 10% of their emissions. The thermal use is about 20, and then the process emissions are about 70% of their overall emissions. So in the long run, there's no way to reduce their emissions to sufficient levels without addressing the process side of things. And so that is, but to your broader point, yes, it would be thinking about it as a sort of holistic perspective on their emissions. Colin, did you want to add something?
Yes, thanks, Peter. The only thing I wanted to add, I think you covered it, but is that their current proposal really only deals with the destruction of those high global warming potential HFCs, PFCs, those high global warming potential substances. So Peter's certainly right that it would essentially put a bubble over them in terms of, I think, and at least in terms of the PUC process, but their plan, to my knowledge so far, is just to focus those reductions on really their industrial processes sector emissions.
Okay, I take that as an answer, but I guess I have to then follow up and say, well, then why is that decision in front of the PUC instead of in front of DEC?
So it could ultimately be, I think it may end up there. I think if we think about the climate action plan and the way in which the tools that we utilize to get to emissions reductions are going to be implemented from various quarters, right? The PUC overseeing the clean heat standard, for example, or the Agency of Transportation implementing electric vehicle incentives and charging infrastructure. Ultimately, the regulatory backstop lies with the Agency of Natural Resources. And I think that would be the same sort of thing that I would envision here.
Well, thanks, Peter. Any other comments from folks? Are there things that are left off of the high priority list here? I have to say, I think refrigerant management is a huge potential gainer here. And I very much like the idea of figuring out how to use the anaerobic emissions that we're creating. So those two strike me as being really sensible. And I'm not sure what is the best way of dealing with chip manufacturing, but I have no reason at the moment to think that this is a bad approach. I mean, you've got a belt and suspenders in there. Either it works or we have to do something different.
Yeah, which is, it is kind of articulating in the proposal what exists in statute, right? Which is the Global Warming Solutions Act is a belt and suspenders approach. We do our best to come up with a suite of policies to reduce emissions, and in the absence of success, the Agency of Natural Resources is charged with finding more direct regulatory pathways.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Now, I think the question for any of us at this point would be, are there significant issues that are not addressed on your list? And you've got 3 high priority items. That's nice. Obviously, agriculture is being treated elsewhere. So I'm just opening up the question, is there something else? And if not, can I ask the committee, are we in agreement? All right, looks like we are. Thanks, Peter.
Do we have Ed in the house yet? Can't see.
Looks like it.
Awesome. All right, great. Take it away, Liz.
Sure. So electricity sector, and understanding just a couple of baseline things, I guess. Number one, there are a number of recommendations in other subcommittees that came about focusing specifically initially on mitigation and resiliency, but certainly touch upon electricity. And then, of course, the recommendations that we just heard, a number of them concern electrification and pathways to reduce GHGs through that means. So in the electricity, kind of subgroup, the focus was on specific additional reductions within the electricity sector, understanding the Science and Data Committee's work on GHG reporting and both on how we calculate emissions within Vermont, as well as what the best practices and evolving practices are for how we should do so going forward. And so all of the discussion that we've had hearing from the Science and Data Committee about what they've already articulated there and presented to the committee, along with the next steps through RFI, RFP on additional work that will be done post December 1st. And I say that because I see in the chat some of the non-committee member, but nevertheless, things we're all looking at with regard to GHG emissions and how it's counted. Just want to make clear up front that the work we've done as a subcommittee throughout has been based upon, the way Vermont has, and in accordance with what the Science and Data Committee has recommended, will at this time continue to do to report those GHG emissions, and of course, current law within the RES framework in terms of renewability. Understood that there are many issues and opinions there, as well as things to look at. And I believe the Science and Data recommendations on some of those will be in the climate action plan, and we'll be moving forward through those RFIs and RFPs. Having said that, the 3 recommendations that we've presented previously, just high level, and I can share a screen in a moment, just want to orient you. Oh boy, I'm getting low power mode. Hold on one second. Switching, it's the love technology. There we go. I'm powered again. The 3 recommendations we had put forward were electrification for all, thinking about pathways to enable better equity in electrification for homeowners and businesses. I'm trying to bring my hand down, as well as, there we go, as well as enabling and continuing to encourage the load control features, both through utilities as well as energy service companies and directly with consumers. And then third, moving to 100% RES. And as you may recall, when utilizing the first framework for ranking that we were using, all of those ranked low ultimately because of the GHG emissions reductions within just those categories, because of course you need to take into account the electrification that's going to occur with them. And I think we all agreed that it didn't make sense to treat those in isolation, and that they should be considered for elevation to discuss in the climate action plan, because they are foundational or enabling in some way that is important to recognize and put forward as recommendations on behalf of the council. So with that potentially overly lengthy introduction, let me ask Ed if he has anything to add, and otherwise I can share a still in progress updated ranking screen with all of you. Ed, do you have anything to add?
No, well, I guess the only other thing is sort of the reiteration that we need to get the electric sector right, because so much of transportation and buildings is dependent on electrification. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Great, fair enough. And I should say that this picture that I'm about to share, Ed and I are meeting right after this meeting to ensure that it's finalized and then shifted into the wording that we all have due. So you are seeing in real time discussion between the two of us probably in a moment here too. Hold on one second. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So I've highlighted in yellow the places where at this point we've modified the screen, and I understand that we may move the enabling foundational just to the overall ranking, but I wanted to pull it out just to show you why we upped the prioritization. And so even though under current law and with all of the discussions that we had a moment ago, the actual mitigation impact for the 100% res, for example, is low, it's clearly enabling and foundational. And we know that over the next course of years, we're going to need to move that portfolio to 100% renewable to achieve all of our goals. And so we suggest including it with the plan and ranking it higher than it otherwise would in order to do that. Equity and electrification should likely be moved to higher, not just for that reason, but also because, having now had a chance to look at the detailed presentation from Cadmus, the number of items, the number of things that people will need to fuel switch and in large part electrify, but not just electrify, moves that clearly to an enabling mechanism, as well as therefore actual GHG impact, in the sense that it will help us achieve the goals that you've already heard about. And so moving that up higher is a recommendation for that reason. And then finally, the grid optimization. You could, I think reasonable minds can differ on where this should rank within the GHG emissions bucket for the reasons we've talked about previously. Largely, it's about actually more efficiently and therefore more cost effectively utilizing the grid. But there are strategies within that when you think about moving toward more hourly reporting of how emissions are counted in the future, for example, that can actually impact directly GHGs. And perhaps more importantly, and the reason why this would be elevated in our suggestion, these are tools that, again, allow the other things that will reduce emissions more directly to be done more efficiently and cost effectively, and therefore are enabling and really important to do well. I'll stop there. Ed, do you want to react before we turn it over?
No, thanks for doing that.
Great. I can stop screen sharing if you'd like, folks, so we can all see each other to discuss, or I can leave it up for a minute. What do you prefer?
Basis.
Okay. Basis, good. Is this the ultimate silent as assent? I don't know. So
No, I think I'm asking whether folks want to go first. I don't need to be asking all these questions. Joey?
Thank you, guys. Question for you too, actually, and maybe more, but how in your screen are you thinking about the resiliency benefits? You spoke to it a little bit, but if you could put a finer point on that, that would be very helpful. And then also, to some of the conversation that is happening in the chat, and you addressed a little bit, Liz, like, how are you guys thinking about, avoiding lock-in? Like, I'm just like thinking like about trying to avoid consequences from short-sighted decisions when we need to be looking longer term. I'm not being very articulate there,
Yeah,
but
okay.
kind of-
I'll take a first shot if you don't mind. On resiliency, one of the reasons that the electrification for all or electrification equity is elevated is in order to pick up those benefits or acknowledge them. These are the same strategies that other sectors within our group, as well as other committees, have also picked up on. So you will see strategies in the Rural Resiliency Committee, for example, that really dovetail well with making sure, for example, the resiliency zone work that folks have mentioned, but also on-farm energy and making sure that transportation switches happen and all of that. So resiliency is definitely a part of the equity in electrification recommendation. And I think to the extent that load control and just generally grid management also can help with that, I think that's important to also recognize. So in doing the write-up, I think it's a great idea to make sure that we recognize those co-benefits. On the other issue, I'll let Ed speak to it. He had mentioned a second ago, trying to get it right in terms of the questions. I think it's a fundamental question for this council. At what level our recommendation should be put forward and can be put forward in order to have broad support with regard to moving to 100% clean or renewable energy. And from the conversations we've had thus far, it was a perspective that I agree with, that I think I heard, that having an overall high-level recommendation to move to that would be something that the council broadly would support, and that broadly would support the activity of the various recommendations we're putting forward. And that when you get below that to the details, there is opportunity for both discussion as well as disagreement, but having a strong, clear consensus that moving Vermont to 100% cleaner renewable energy is important, and is something that it seems from our prior conversation there's broad support for on the council. So that's a way of saying the intention that we have had is to elevate that as a recommendation for the whole council to support, recognizing that there are many design issues. It's not unlike clean heat standard in that regard, because of course there's an existing framework, RES, which may itself change. I suppose you could take RES and literally cross out 75 and move to 100, but I don't think anyone we've heard from, or myself or Ed, thinks that that's what Vermont would do or should do. But putting out that recommendation as a high-level goal is important, and then let the design happen from there.
Yeah, and Joey, if I can also just add, completely agree about sort of the lock-in piece, and I understand where that's coming from. Part of the reason that we're recommending do a study, essentially look at this, is because power supply procurements are really long-term, and things change considerably over time. For example, in 2005, we had this program that got lots of stuff built. None of those RECs are kept in state anymore. Those are mostly sold out of state because of legislative changes 10 years later. There's strong legislative policy encouraging Hydro-Quebec at one point. That contract now goes until 2034, I believe. So I would rather take a little bit more time. Right now, we're on a good path. When you look at Science and Data Committee, EFG's recommendations, everything else, it's pretty clear that the electric sector right now, for this particular moment in time, is okay. We can definitely improve, and we can improve in lots of ways, adding additional co-benefits, thinking more about equity, thinking about the longer term. And those all, to me, counsel to try to create a really good study and looking at all the different alternatives, all the different permutations. What does Vermont want? And try to just keep something that honestly we can pick and we're not going to change every 10 years. Like the longer that we can keep the policy in place, the better off for Vermonters overall. And again, that's why it's really important to get that right.
Thank you, guys. Can I just follow up and ask one more question? Sorry. So recognizing this is not, unique to your, the work that you guys have been doing in the electric sector, but it applies more broadly. It feels like a little bit like demoralizing and challenging the way, our current federal system incents the deployment of renewable technologies. And it's not something Vermont has agency over, but the fact that renewables scrapped for investment and production tax credits and fossil fuels are embedded in the US tax code, and that Vermonters who do not have a tax appetite cannot avail themselves of those solutions in the same way, or it's harder. It seems like a massive equity issue. So I don't want to put more on your plate, but I think it would be important to send a signal from the Climate Council and potentially through your work in particular, because it's largely showing up in the electric space. And as we electrify more things, to talk about that like fundamental disconnect between, significant annual like subsidies for the fossil fuel sector and the more challenging, which makes it less cost effective, although it's increasingly cost effective despite all that for the renewable energy industry. And I think that would very much help with, as we deploy more, we need to deploy more in-state renewables, like helping Vermonters access those economic benefits and have more interest in agency overseeing the systems that we're going to need to deploy, and maybe in their backyards or mine. So I don't know if there's some principles or articulation that you guys could consider, or that we should sort of collectively note as a council. Sorry, Jane. But I think it's just really an important challenge.
Yeah, can I actually just follow up on that a little bit? Would it provide more comfort if there was a more concrete action? For example, the recommendation would be what the Climate Council commission a study. There's lots of different groups. There's Clean Energy States Alliance. There's other folks who do this to essentially design a draft res with public input. Basically have it instead of, consider 100% res, have a more concrete action with certain priorities embedded within that. Would that, so I see Christine likes the idea. Joey, does that get to some of what you're talking about?
I mean, that's part of it when it comes to the res, or
Yeah,
like a whole new way. I mean, but I'm also saying just writ large, like unless we do something federally, this whole context upon which we are operating. And I think the Climate Council pointing at that as a fundamental principle may be helpful. So yes, and.
Joey, I'm wondering if the place to do that might be, well, there's probably more than one place we can do it, but there are federal proposals right now to make sure that appliances, for want of a better word, things like chargers and storage and heat pumps, and have federal support direct to consumer. And, it feels like pointing out that that's the direction that should be taken for all decarbonization efforts. And that includes, obviously, on the generation side, something like that might be a place to do it, since there are actually, and there's obviously things pending for renewables they need to go through too, both on the tax credit side and otherwise. So there might be, I don't know if there's a place where we're talking about the moment of federal uncertainty or whatever, but pointing out that there is that federal uncertainty right now, and there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of promise. And to the extent it delivers, it needs to do so in these ways to support our goals.
So let's hear from Chad and then Bram.
Great. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Great spirited discussion today. Thanks for all the hard work. Yeah, I guess I'm in agreement with Ed and Liz and about the general concept of keeping the res kind of a high level recommendation at this point. perhaps with a few caveats. I think, there is this issue about, that started in Paris. The Paris Agreement does speak to the importance of environmental integrity. So I want to make sure that we are communicating that in the CAP, the importance, the integrity of the renewable energy standard. I do get a little concerned about legal and perhaps reputational jeopardy for the state if we are purchasing Hydro-Quebec RECs as a means of, and therefore allowing additional, gas peaker plants throughout the region to operate, right? I mean, we are part of a regional grid, so and everything affects our climate, right? So, if you look at the definition in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, Vermont shall reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from within the geographical boundaries of the state and those emissions outside the boundaries of the state that are caused by the use of energy in Vermont. When you think about that in consideration also of, what came out of the Paris Accord, I just want to make sure that we are keeping, carbon accountability high on the list. And, we're not obviously going to solve that issue in a month, but I'd like to make sure that we are moving forward to an understanding that, the concept of additionality is super important. It's what bends the curve on carbon moving forward. And there's plenty of academic and scholarly research out there that speaks to why, carbon offsets from existing generation are not offering any additionality, and in fact can result in increases in emissions, which is absolutely something we don't want. So I don't have all the answers. There's a lot of people out there way smarter than I am. I'm just an entrepreneur trying to, grow a clean energy business here in Vermont. So I welcome other thoughts from others who, swim in the swimming pool on a daily basis. But I really do feel strongly, and as you can see in the chat, as a member of the council representing the clean energy sector, this is an issue of significant concern out there. So I do want to make sure that we, at least provide reference to it. And then, to Ed's point, if we, have studies or we have, work beyond December 1st to kind of formalize, how we address this, great. But I think we've got to acknowledge it at this point. There's just too much. I just see too much risk, too much exposure for the state. So thanks for the time.
Thanks, Chad. Bron?
I'd also like to acknowledge the conversation in the chat and the very real concerns and costs of many of the forms of renewable energy, and say that there are no perfect forms of energy, right? There's a cost to solar, there's a cost to wind, there's a cost to hydro, there's a cost to geothermal. However, I would, take a step back and just kind of remind all of us that there is a certain amount of coal in the ground, and there's a certain amount of natural gas, and there's a certain amount of oil. And really the question before us is how much of that carbon are we going to put into the atmosphere before we stop using it? It could be all of it. We could pull all of it out and put all of the carbon into the atmosphere. But at some point, we're going to go to zero fossil fuel use, either because we run out or because we decide to stop using it before we run out. And, absolutely, mining lithium causes all kinds of trouble. However, I think, it's pretty clear that we will be judged as a species on how much fossil fuel we successfully leave in the ground. And to that end, as imperfect as all the other forms may be, I think it incumbent upon us to move as quickly as we can to a zero fossil fuel world. And that means electrifying transportation, electrifying heating, and moving towards 100% renewable electricity. None of it's perfect. It can't all happen overnight, but I think in the big picture, that is the imperative for us as a species, for us as a country, for us as a state, and for us as a council.
Thanks, Bram. Jared?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciated Ed's suggestion that it could be worth having some design options on the table for a res, you know, having some kind of expert consulting group with public input start to go through that process. I mean, what I've found is that it's really, while I broadly, of course, support moving towards 100% carbon free and then 100% renewable energy standard, I think that in terms of being able to assess that as a policy or a framework in terms of its emissions reduction benefit, in terms of its equity implications, its cost effectiveness, questions about reliability and resilience, I think the details really matter. And so, you know, I think that at this point in time, I agree that we should say yes to that overall framework, but it's not a final answer. And I think it would be helpful to do as Ed suggests, to begin the process of getting some design options on the table for sake of comparison. I also think that it is, I will be the first person, and I will say it repeatedly, incredibly important that we are as transparent, accurate, and consistent with our GHG accounting. That's why we are moving forward with a request for information so that we can do upstream and life cycle emissions accounting on all of our energy sources, not just electricity. Electricity is critically important, but it is only a part of the overall energy picture. And you know, we also need to be concerned about life cycle and upstream emissions from natural gas and all of the fossil fuels that we use, which is 74% of our pollution from the transportation and thermal sectors. So yes, let's focus on electricity, let's get it right, but we also need to make sure that we are not missing the really important challenge and opportunity around electrification of our transportation and thermal sectors. So I just want to lend support to what Ed suggested in terms of a next step being design options that give us some more specificity on what 100% res might look like. Because I think that'll be really important to getting the conversation down to the ground so we can wrestle with it and do some comparison.
Okay, I see this conversation could go on a while, but let me put on the table the question that Jared just posed, and which is really echoing something that Liz and Ed said, that the recommendation from this committee could be amplified by not just recommending movement to 100% clean electricity standard, but in addition, recommending that the council recommend conducting a study that would examine the definition of clean electricity and the options available to the state going forward. And that we not just assume, and I think Liz was clear on this, that we would be building the 100% recommendation on the 75%, the rules that we're using for the 75% res that are in effect today. I'm asking the question whether the committee would suggest to the task leads that they amplify their recommendation to call for that kind of inquiry. So
Can
Joey,
I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Could that inquiry not be embedded within the assessment, the life cycle emissions assessment? We want the best available information. We want a full, like, a fair and full context of where our energy is coming from, what are the carbon emissions, impacts of that energy. It seems like potentially this could be embedded in it. I don't think we need a formal study of a res. I think we can do what Vermonters have done well and like come together and think about and bring people together through a stakeholder process that the Climate Council does not need to like anoint to figure out what this could look like. But I do think there could be some way to weave this into the analysis that's about to be underway.
I'm not sure I understood that, but maybe someone else will illuminate it.
Can I just respond to that? Joey, so it sounds like what you're saying is the RFI that's coming out of science, so the recommended RFI coming out of science and data of looking at the upstream carbon emissions, that you would roll a study in about res design into that. And it's no, okay.
I mean, do we need a study of res design, or can we not in the state of Vermont have a stakeholder process that, I mean, if the council sort of sets forth a general parameter, I'm not 100% clear we need a study.
I took you to mean that you were thinking you get that foundational work done, and then taking that information, you do the next thing. And and Richard had it right. The recommendation that we are putting forward, just even as is to move to 100%. And it literally in charts that you've seen says clean or renewable or carbon free or renewable. In other words, even those questions, given the way current law is defined, need to be readdressed. And so it makes sense to me that step one would be that GHG accounting work, if that's what you're suggesting. And then step two is we've put up on the screen before the list of questions. It's not the only questions, but it's a kind of, relatively long list of things that need to be addressed in moving to 100% for a statutory framework for electricity. And some of those questions hit things that have been raised today: carbon free versus renewable under what definition, in state versus out of state, what scale, what year, because additionality is important. And, our fellow New England states define new all the way back to, someone could tell me, I think it's 2003 or 5, whereas we don't. So there's all sorts of questions that would need to get addressed.
And I would also say too, my recommendation for a study is informed by the fact that we've got this New England states vision where all the energy folks from the New England states are pushing ISO New England studying to get to 100% renewable by 2050. What does that look like? How do you manage the system? What are the costs? What are the revenue streams for renewable generation when the value of energy is potentially declining? There's a lot of moving pieces, and I would recommend getting some forecasts, some thoughts about what are the relative costs, economic costs, and then also thinking about equity as well. And that having somebody help pull all those threads together and present that in a clearer way to folks who need to make the decision. It's not a simple thing to design a res, and I think that the study actually would be very helpful.
So let me ask whether, I see Jared and Chad have their hands up. We're past time to conclude this conversation, so I want to be efficient here. Do you think, Ed and Liz, that you could craft the recommendation that would reflect the conversation we've just had? So are there other comments anybody wants to make to give direction to them? I think this has been a really robust conversation. I really appreciate it.
Just to wrap it, Rich, do we have, with that amendment that Rich just offered and that Liz and Ed just agreed to, do we have comfort with the recommendations that's put forward by this group of test leads?
Okay. Speak if you have a problem. Thanks. All right.
Before we get to public comment, Rich, I think we should have a discussion about our agenda. We are about 20 minutes behind at the moment. And I know everybody, this was a really important and really good conversation. I know everybody is a little, probably a little taxed and could probably use a short break. I think, Jared, you and I could probably go through the sectoral proportionality a little bit faster than the time allotted on the calendar or on the agenda. And so I would suggest that we do public comment and then take a quick kind of 7-minute break to give people a little bit of moment to stretch their legs and maybe shove a little bit of food in their face if they have time. Is that reasonable to folks? And then we'll just be efficient and pick it up on the back end.
I think that works. So let's take a few minutes for public comment. I'll begin by appreciating the dialogue in the chat. I think we should preserve that chat, make sure that we can make reference to it going forward.
George?
Afternoon. Yeah, I was enjoying the give and take on this topic about renewable energy standard and what it might look like in the future. I think this is actually an overdue conversation because my perception, the electric sector has a long ways to go. And there's severe challenges ahead, especially if we look at expanding total electrical demand 50, even 100% over the next decade. And the planning process at ICE New England is important. I think Vermont has been, shall we say, a little bit on the margins of that discussion. I think we may have to wade into the middle of that conversation a lot more than we have in the past. With respect to where to go with legislation for next generation renewable energy standard, I would recommend actually becoming more independent of RECs, and really what really matters is greenhouse gas emissions, and it would likely be an emissions reduction standard, ideally one that actually matched up megawatt hours to that have a tagged greenhouse gas emissions amount or mass to each hour of the power that Vermont's purchased, so that you can actually set a ceiling of total emissions for utility per year and reduce it 4 or 5% per year. And it's shown to be synchronous to the load. And that's important because RECs, as you know, are completely divorced in time and space from when the actual electricity is being generated versus where it's actually being applied in a regulatory context. So one of the things I think that you need to do to get a bona fide clean grid is to be able to do that synchronization of our renewable generation, our zero emissions or low emissions generation synchronous to the presented load. That is challenging technically, but it is, I think, our holy, that's our North Star for this project as far as electrical generation. With respect to the other sectors, I think that's a comment that I'd have to postpone because I'm not really prepared to talk about yet. But I do believe the clean energy, clean heat standard does have some areas for improvement. Its reliance on wood pellets and advanced wood heating need to be examined a little more closely. Life cycle emissions of those, I think, will be a potential red flag. Thank you.
Bill Bender.
Yes, thank you, Rich. So it's really kind of simple to solve this problem. We either have to reduce our usage, as Annette Smith is suggesting, and get more and more efficient, or we have to build renewables, or the reality is we have to do both. We're not going to suddenly go back to a different era, and I don't think the Vermont population is going to go for that. So the biggest solution here is building renewables. That has to be done, and especially as we add more and more, as we electrify more things, the only way we get a benefit from that is by simultaneously building renewables. Vermont is the second most land abundant state east of the Mississippi after only Maine. Renewables are fundamentally land intensive. And so if anything, Vermont should be building way more than its share of renewables. We have more land than any of our neighbors, surrounded by Boston, New York, and Montreal. We should be a major exporter of renewable energy, not an importer. The big issue is that Hydro-Quebec attributes, which are not recognized by anyone else, are not legal RECs. They can't be RECs because they're too old. 80% of Hydro-Quebec power is 20th century. That does not change anything. We could say it's renewable from an old definition, but it's not renewable under the Paris Climate Accord. And it's not additional. We need additionality, which means we have to build new things, which is primarily wind and solar. The Hydro-Quebec additional construction underway right now, more than 100% of it goes to the increased consumption in Quebec. So there's no additionality with anything we do with that those Hydro-Quebec attributes. So the solution is building lots and lots of solar and wind as fast as we can. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Following up on Peter's suggestion, why don't we take a 7-minute break? We'll come back at 1:32.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Okay with that? Thanks, everybody.
Volunteered to participated in to try to understand what we might recommend for what the sort of baseline of proportionality would look like. So Jane, we skipped ahead and we'll come back to you. Just wanted to get started. So Jared, if you want to share your screen and show the memo that we put together for the council's consideration. We're sharing with you all for your feedback, but it was requested directly by the council.
Thanks, Peter. I'm hoping that my connection is good. If I start being choppy, just like text me something and I'll switch to phone. But let me go ahead and share screen. Can folks see this? Okay, great. Can folks see this memo? Okay. Have emerged as we've gone about doing the analysis that was clear we needed greater clarification about. One is, what does this mean, reflecting the relative contribution of in the context of being in a list of 8 other objectives listed in this section of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so hopefully folks have had a chance to review this document, but the first question we wanted to ask is, how should we interpret this, the language around category?
Jared, you're breaking up.
And I think it's really important to document on your screen if I'm not able to be heard. Sorry, our Wi-Fi seems to be having problems.
Yeah, Jared, why don't you stop sharing your screen for folks? I'll pull it up from the website, from the agenda, but it is also available for you in the linked in the agenda. But let me bring that up for everybody if you can. Then we can hear your words better, Jared. Okay, so this goes through.
I'll wait for that to come up. I'm also going to send.
All right, so can folks see that?
We can see it, Peter.
Okay, so the 2 questions that Jared was describing were, 1, how should the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions be interpreted? And then the question of how should we interpret and assess the 8 objectives listed in that whole stream of lists? And so, Jared, are you able to speak to continue on?
You should probably do it, Peter.
Yeah.
All right, so this is analysis, as you'll recall, that Jared shared with us and with the Science and Data Committee several months ago now. Initially starting this conversation around sort of trying to understand what how we define relative proportion. We're all clear on what the baseline years are for evaluation of emissions, but sectoral contribution is not defined in the same manner. And so where we ultimately landed was on with the data that we as the state, that the Department of Environmental Conservation has confidence in that latest data. So in the 2017 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we have the data in there for 2018, which we have yet to finalize into a separate inventory, but feel solid in the analysis to use that as the sort of the baseline establishment of relative contribution. So therefore, looking at sort of current state, where do emissions reductions need to come from? Other options include using either the 1990 or 2005 or both as comparison items is another way to think about it, right? For 2025, it would be a sort of straight line emissions reduction from the 2005 number, or vice versa for 2030, it would be from 1990. Those present a number of challenges in our mind that don't reflect the current work that's been done and the current increase in new emission sources in the industrial sector. And so to work from that would be it's the recommendation of this group to pursue the 2018 as the relative source contribution sort of establishment point. What that suggests below is sort of look at the table that we're hovering over now, shows the relative contributions during each period of time, whether 1990, 2005, or 2018. And so what we would then do.
Peter, there's no table All we're seeing is the top of your draft memo. So if there's
I
something
think
else,
yeah, it's not moving as you go down.
if you
That's
could make it
weird.
move, that'd be great.
That's weird.
Otherwise, we can all definitely just click the link in the agenda.
Yeah, we can look at that if that's easier.
Yeah, why don't you do that? It's the share of statewide emissions by sector and year. I don't know why it's usually it gets into like the pause mode if I'm not moving around. So I'm gonna stop sharing. So
Do you want me to share? I have it open.
if you can make it move, sure. And I see Jared's back via phone, so maybe I'll let him, the expert, take over the speaking.
Sure, thanks, Peter. I unfortunately cannot hardwire it in my office. I am too far away. You know, one of the things I had noticed a comment in the chat. I want to make really clear, this is not a question. This memo does not make any suggestions about how we measure emissions from the electricity sector. The assumption here is that the data that we have to work with for this iteration of the Climate Action Plan is the officially published GHG inventory from the Department of Environmental Conservation and Agency of Natural Resources. We have committed as a council that we're going to do an RFI to look at supplemental analysis around upstream and life cycle emissions. There is no recommendation baked in here about how we measure our electricity sector emissions, what we do when we get responses to that RFI. All this is a conversation about what is the appropriate reference year to determine, at least the first part of this, to determine how we assess each sector's share of responsibility. And, you know, I think you can see points A, B, and C around why we think that 2018 is the most appropriate reference year, because it starts from the latest available data that was at hand when the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed, and it doesn't go back in time to a very different set of circumstances. One thing that would be, if you conflated these different issues of the baseline year to measure reductions against and the reference year to determine sectoral shares of proportional responsibility, then you could basically, what the net result of that would be, if you used a 1990 or 2005 reference year for emissions from each sector going forward, then the outcome of that would be saying to the electricity sector, you can significantly increase your emissions above the 2018 levels. And I would also note that any changes that are made to the inventory methodology going forward would be backcasted across all of the years. So if it's found that there is a more appropriate methodology to use going forward, that wouldn't just apply to 2019. That would look at the portfolio and the purchases all through the set of data that we have historically. So this is not a recommendation on how to account for the electricity sector emissions. It's assuming that we're working with the inventory we have now. We're going to continue looking there. This is about what year. And if folks want to see more happening in the electricity sector, choosing 2018, the most recent year, as the reference year ensures that is the only way to actually ensure that we get further reductions from the electricity sector. So that's the first part. I think I should stop there before going on to section 2 to see if people have questions, comments about the sectoral shares of responsibility reference here.
So I can't see hands if any are up. So if people have questions, just speak up. Simply stated, Jared, I think that this recommendation makes sense.
This won't, this is going to get some discussion at the council itself. So appreciate that this isn't the only time that it'll be brought up, and that if you have further feedback for us, please consider sharing that with us offline, but appreciate the time to go through that. All right, in the interest of time, Jane, do you want to jump into drafting process schedule?
Peter, can we just pause on the second recommendation there?
Oh,
That was in the
sorry,
memo?
yes.
And so the second piece of this question was that there, in that portion of the Global Warming Solutions Act, 8 different objectives are listed that we should be aiming to further with the recommendations of the Climate Action Plan. As you read through those 8, it's very clear that it is possible for some of them to be in conflict or in tension with another. And so we just wanted to kind of clarify, memorialize our interpretation of this, that it's our responsibility to use our best judgment of what will be in the best interest of meeting the overall intent and assembled goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. It will sometimes be possible that we can meet certain objectives and not be able to meet others. We include a for instance here that, in the case that, different sectors are at different points of feasibility in terms of the technologies and programs and practices available to them to reduce emissions, different measures for how we reduce pollution are available for different sectors, and different actions have different equity implications. And so we want to be clear that if and when some of these objectives are in conflict, we need to use our best judgment. And specifically, if it's difficult to meet objective 2, say that one sector does not have readily available, cost-effective, technologically feasible or equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathways, that is understandable. And we would want to allow that sector, using our best judgment and in consideration of those other objectives, to perhaps come in under their rigid or kind of narrowed interpretation of that sectoral share. So long as other sectors that have more ability to reduce emissions cost effectively, equitably, et cetera, are more than making up for that, because in the end, we need to make sure that the overall gross emissions reduction requirements are still met. But we also know that not every sector has equal ability or opportunity to reduce emissions at different points in time. And so while this reference year for the relative contributions of emissions by sector is an important objective, it's something that we're going to track and reference, it should not be on its own narrowly or rigidly determinative, absent consideration of those 7 other objectives, which we interpret as being at least equally important, given that it is a list of objectives to further that is not prioritized or listed in an order or said that this one is more important than another. They're presented in a way that they're all important objectives that we should aim to further to the extent we can. So that's the presentation of that second piece. Would invite any comments, questions on that as well.
So I do have a comment. I agree generally with everything you just said, Jared, but I would like to emphasize a point that I think the legislature did make and did intend in the GWSA. The requirement of proportionality across sectors is intended to impose a discipline on us to look at things that might be hard and to come up with policies that would reduce emissions in places that historically have been resistant or have been difficult to treat, let's put it that way. And that we should take that mandate to heart. That is, it's not an excuse to look away from sectors where we think achievement would be difficult. And I think you mean that. And I want to be clear that proportionality is, as you say, just one of the criteria listed. But on the other hand, the bottom line is that the plan has to add up to an emissions reduction total that meets the goals. So it's just can't, we just can't say, well, it's too hard to look at this sector. We can't do that because particularly in transportation and buildings, there's no way to achieve the goals without doing some hard work. Anyway, I think you mean that. I just wanted to emphasize the point.
Yes, thanks, Rich. Agreed.
Rich, I would offer a slight friendly amendment if you're willing to consider it. Is the idea of we are looking for emissions reductions in all sectors. We also understand that some things are going to move at uneven paces. So when we look back at the 2025 data to show where we got emissions reductions from, it may not perfectly match our sector by sector proportionality piece. And that's okay, right? That we've driven towards that result in a way that we're working for sectoral action in each sector, but where the precise math is gonna shake out somewhat differently.
I totally agree. It's a question of discipline on the one hand, and being smart and practical and effective at the same time.
Okay. All right, Jane, let's talk schedule.
Okay, so I think everybody knows that November 2nd is the next time cross-sector will be the focus of the council meeting. The goal of that meeting being where both the components of the climate action plan will be reviewed, as well as including obviously your final suite of actions brought forward. That meeting will also include a presentation by ESG and Cadmus around the final modeling, which includes the economic modeling as well, which they'll be ready to present on next week with all of you if there's capacity in the agenda, knowing how much there's to do between now and then too. So I think that for this group, unlike some of the other subcommittees, it's pretty clear the task leads are leading their drafting for each of their sections, and you all have the staff support that you've requested in order to help do that. The goal had been to have those components posted a full week ahead of time, which is what we're striving for now with the council, recognizing that they need time to review substantive policy considerations since there isn't enough time in the schedule at the meeting to actually review it all. And so knowing how challenging that was specifically for this subcommittee, we set the stage at the council meeting last week that the materials from cross-sector won't get posted till next Friday, giving you one extra meeting to sort of work through the drafts and have you as a committee agree to the drafts put forward by your task leads. I'll also say that unlike perhaps other subcommittees, because your work is broken down sectorally, you'll have an opportunity to also, in addition to putting together the pathways, strategies, and action, which I'll, recognizing time, will just say, please lean into the CAP drafting process document, which clearly spells out what the drafting for pathway strategies and actions should look like, and just ask me any questions you have around clarifying expectations there. But also the way the action table is formatted in the CAP drafting process should be an easy cut and paste for you to use and pull your information into. But then largely the responsibility will be a framing section up front for each of those components of the work, and that we haven't given a lot of discretion there around what that looks like, but I imagine, transportation is a great example of setting the stage about the transformation that needs to happen in that sector and being mindful of the short-term gains that we need to make with electrification, and then speaking to those farther out shifts in, just consuming less and driving yet less, and then referencing the other sections of the CAP that speak to that. And so we're asking that people frame up those summary statements for each sector with brevity, no more than 1 to 2 pages, just recognizing that there's a lot to unfold. And your co-chairs supported, I know Joey, you're interested in helping with this, and Megan O'Toole, who's not here, offered to be the person to take pen to paper for the shitty first draft for the first 3 of you to review and then pull out to the subcommittee, we'll frame up the whole emissions reduction section of the cap. And so I think our understanding and expectation would be that those drafts would be ready to share amongst the subcommittee by Wednesday of next week for me to post those. So you all can come to the meeting on Thursday having reviewed them. And then hopefully we can work through any remaining issues on those drafts that day so they can be posted the following day for counselors to review. I think that's largely it in a nutshell. The cap drafting process really does speak to all the clarity around posting, revisions, how that's all going to happen. So hopefully you have all of that. I have the outline and some other things open that I would have pulled up if we had more time to talk through, but that's really the gist of it, and setting a timeline and expectations so that the subcommittee can review it before it gets posted, I think was the general goal in bringing it up today.
Thanks, Jane. Very efficient.
So Jane, so just to summarize, we need a draft by next Wednesday. Oh, excuse me, we need, just to summarize, we need a draft by next Wednesday, and we have to have our equity evaluation done by then, because that's got to be part of it.
Thank you. Can I just, that was a great pin that I didn't speak to, Gina. So let me clarify that before you your question. The equity screening has appreciating and recognizing it's evolving a bit. We're going to talk about it in detail on Tuesday at the council because it's an appreciation actually through your work last week that the expectation around what you're supposed to get out of that scoring rubric, a score, is really not possible with the level of specificity that we have with these policy ideas. It really should come as programs are designed. And so I encourage folks to use the scoring rubric in order to elevate and write the equity section in your cap, but appreciate that you won't be able to have a score, nor were you supposed to transfer a score into the cap. It was really to elevate questions for you to and speak to components of the ideas you're putting forward. I wouldn't focus on like filling out a scoring rubric on everything for next week. I would use it to guide how you're going to write the cap. And Kaya will join again next week so that we can revisit any questions that have come up through your drafting of the cap and application of the scoring rubric across your high priority or across all your actions that are coming into the body of the cap, so that if anything needs to be spoken to or clarified in a group support kind of conversation, she'll be here to help guide that.
Okay, thank you.
Christine?
I'm not sure I'm clear. The buildings section of the cap is still due by the end of the day on Tuesday, October 26th. Is that right?
Nope, you got a little more time. So it is due now by the end of the day on Wednesday to post for comments and deliberations here at this subcommittee. And then on Thursday, then you'll have one day to make any final revisions, and then it'll get posted for the council on Friday.
So the deadline now has moved from close of business Tuesday, the 26th to close of business Wednesday, the 27th.
And it's become an internal deadline so that your subcommittee can review the drafts before they go to the council. That date of the 26th was originally to be posted for the whole council.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions and the clarification. Anything further, Jane? We can move to public comment.
It would be good to just, yeah, so you feel like you addressed the equity screen considerations piece?
Yeah, in as much clarity as I feel like I have at this point too. I mean, the expectation, it felt like a moving target, and it does feel like the scoring rubric should really be used to the best of your ability on the actions that you're lifting up into the cap. But I just wouldn't expect that you'll be able to get a score because we haven't been able to do so to date on any of the ideas put forward.
We have.
Agreed.
Yeah, Chris.
And I mean, we know that the program details are where a lot of that is going to get taken care of. Thanks very much for that. Let's turn to public comment. Christine, is your hand old one? Yeah. Ben, I know you've been waiting.
Thanks for taking an extra moment. I know you are running a little bit long. I just wanted to, this is a little bit doubling back to an issue that has been covered, but definitely wanted to just say a quick word about how some of the conversation around the renewable energy standard relates to the proportionality memo. Largely, VPIRG is very supportive of the direction the proportionality memo takes, and setting that 2018 baseline certainly makes sense. As you say, it's not defined in statute, and it makes sense to have clarity across the council on that. At the bottom of sub B on page 2, though, there's a sentence that talks about how essentially nothing new needs to be done in the electric sector for the electric sector to get its greenhouse gas job done. I'm paraphrasing, of course, and it stops a little bit short of literally saying we shouldn't be doing, anything more than the rest we already have. But I think it would be very easy for people who are not watching this closely to read it that way. That does seem to be the implication. I could describe why I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But obviously the electric sector working group has spent a lot of time and very deliberately said, we think there are a lot of open questions about how that should be designed. And this, what I would describe as editorial in the memo, that's a little bit of a tangent off of the core point that it is driving, seems to imply that we don't actually need to do all that work in the electric sector. So that's a concern I have within what is otherwise a memo that is directionally correct in our minds. That last sentence on sub B on page 2 and the subsequent footnote. Thank you for taking a couple of moments.
Thanks for the observation. Do we have any further? Jared?
I'd like the chance to just follow up on Ben's comment at some point, but if there's others in the public comment queue, I don't want to jump ahead. I just wanted to note that if there is the opportunity, I'd like to have the chance to respond.
I don't see any other hands up, so you're on.
Okay. I appreciate that comment, Ben, and I would just note that the reason that was in there was because earlier in the conversations, there were some who had expressed concern about holding the electricity sector to a higher standard than other sectors, because if we use a 2018 reference year, that is the year in which the electricity sector emissions, as measured and reported by ANR, were the lowest they've ever been. The note about compliance with the res, I don't think it's accurate to say that suggests nothing new needs to be done. It assumes ratcheting up the compliance with the res as the res is designed, moving towards at a minimum a 75% renewable, if consistent with this committee's direction and emerging recommendations, likely much higher than that. And we know that those certain tiers are increasing over time. And I would also note that tier 2 is structured, as you and many others know, so that it is a percentage of load. So we know that as we electrify, at a minimum in 2032, 10% of our electricity is going to come from local sources. So that really was not meant to say nothing new needs to be done. It's assuming that at a minimum, more will be done in compliance with the ratcheting up requirements that the existing res has, and likely much more than that will be done if we follow this committee's recommendations. It was not, I think I hear your point, and I agree that it may not have been, maybe it was an unnecessary editorial comment that was really not core to this memo, but it was meant to address concerns about what it would mean for the electricity sector, given that it has been the sector, again, as measured by our official state inventory, that has done the most to reduce emissions over the last 30 years.
All right, thanks, Jared. Ben, I'm reading your note in the chat. I think we don't need to continue this particular dialogue, but I appreciate the point. We should preserve the chat, and maybe you and Jared can follow up on it separately. Anything else for this meeting today? Peter,
I want to say thank you. This is a huge lift today and a lot of work done, and I'm really appreciative of everybody leaning in and asking good questions and engaging. So thanks very much. And I actually will not see you next week, as I will not be here, but I wish you luck.
All right, thanks, Peter. And thanks to the committee. I echo everything Peter just said. This is inspiring to see all this work coming together. And thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.